All right, good afternoon. My name is Assaf Moghadam. I'm the Director of Academic Affairs at the ICT. And I'm happy to moderate this distinguished panel, this event today. I think it's the first time that I'm serving as, I don't think I know, it's the first time I'm serving as a warm-up to a Prime Minister, so I'm very excited. I was pleading until 2 minutes ago for Boaz to moderate the event instead of me, but he insisted I go ahead. 13 years to the day after the horrific events of 9/11, the global jihad movement, which was spawned by the Al-Qaeda organization, continues to evolve and threaten governments and broad parts of the populations in the Middle East and beyond. The rise of the Islamic State, which now dominates significant parts of Syria and Iraq, is only the most recent reminder that even if Al-Qaeda Central has weakened since the death of Osama bin Laden, the threat that is posed by jihadi groups is not likely to dissipate anytime soon. President Obama, in a speech yesterday, provided evidence of the continued relevance of jihadi terrorism to U.S. and indeed to global national security. To assess Western efforts of countering the global jihadi threat, it is really my great pleasure to moderate this truly distinguished panel. I can state, I think, really without exaggeration, that my own thinking of the jihadi threat and of terrorism in general, and of ways to counter this threat, and also that of countless other students of terrorism, is deeply informed by the writings of each one of these gentlemen. So let me introduce the panelists. I'll proceed in alphabetical order, and then we'll start with a Q&A. We'll start with a discussion, and hopefully we'll have some time also for some audience involvement before the Prime Minister, who I understand can just arrive at any time. So anyway, the first Mr. Peter Bergen, who is Vice President, Director of Studies and Fellows, and Vice President of the International Security Program at the New America Foundation. He's also Professor of Practice at Arizona State University, and he's a very, very prominent radio, print, television, and web journalist, document producer, think tank director, and the author or editor of 5 books. Second, and I've introduced Peter Bergen at the previous event, so I'm going to, with your permission, go ahead. Second, we have Brigadier General retired Russell Howard, Director of MonTrep and Professor at the Monterey Institute of International Studies. General Howard is President of Howard's Global Solutions, Director of MonTrep, and an Adjunct Professor. He's also a Senior Fellow at the Joint Special Operations University. He's Senior Mentor for Development Alternatives Incorporated, Senior Advisor for the Singapore Home Team Academy, and on the Board of Advisors for Laser Shot Incorporated. He was an Army Chief of Staff Fellow at the Center for International Affairs at Harvard University, and he was commander of the 1st Special Forces Group Airborne at Fort Lewis, Washington. And our third panelist is Mr. Brian Jenkins, Senior Advisor to the President of the RAND Corporation, and he's the author of many books and monographs on terrorism, including Will Terrorists Go Nuclear, published in 2008, a variety of RAND monographs. He also authored the book Unconquerable Nation, Knowing Our Enemy, Strengthening Ourselves. He's a decorated combat veteran who received the Department of the Army's highest award for his service. In 1996, President Clinton appointed Mr. Jenkins to the White House Commission on Aviation Safety and Security. From 1999 to 2000, he served as advisor to the National Commission on Terrorism. And in 2000, he was appointed to the U.S. Comptroller General's Advisory Board. He's a research associate at the Mineta Transportation Institute, where he directs the continuing research on protecting surface transportation against terrorist attacks. So I would like to now open the raise the first question to the panelists. And the first question I would like to pose at the panelists is that 13 years after the U.S. homeland was struck by Al-Qaeda, Osama bin Laden is dead. The United States has not witnessed another 9/11 style attack on its homeland, and the core of Al-Qaeda seems to be a shadow of its former self. On the other hand, Al-Qaeda's affiliates have expanded into a great number of theaters, and other jihadi groups, such as the Islamic State, wreak havoc in large parts of Syria and Iraq. So my question, and I know it's an unanswerable question, but I'm going to still ask it. Are we better or worse off today in terms of the terrorism threat than we were at the time of 9/11? Who would like to go first?
Why not? Do I need to do something here, or am I going? I'm on. Look, are we better off today than we were 13 years ago? The fact is, you know, look, 3 months after 9/11, I was asked to testify before the Senate Armed Services Committee. And the senator asked me the very first question. He said, Mr. Jenkins, it's been 90 days since 9/11. Nothing has happened. Are we through it yet? I think I gave a smart aleck answer that this wasn't some episode of West Wing, and that question might be better asked in 10-year intervals. We don't know if we're in the 30 Years' War or 4 decades of the Cold War, but it is... In any long struggle, there are going to be changes along the way. There's going to be successes, but there's also going to be setbacks. Some of those setbacks are going to be the consequences, unintended consequences of our own actions. There are going to be surprises, and that is completely unanticipated developments. Some of them external events that affect the course of the struggle. And so if we look at this 13-year period, can we say there have been successes, as you pointed out? Yes, we have degraded some of their operational capabilities of al-Qaeda as a consequence of unprecedented cooperation among the intelligence services and law enforcement organizations worldwide. The operating environment is more hostile to them. We decimated their leadership. We haven't dented their determination one bit. And so this thing goes on. They will morph and adapt to new circumstances. They are currently dealing with internal divisions, but that doesn't stop it either. I suspect that we will be dealing with the effluent, that's the only appropriate word I can think of. We will be dealing with the effluent of the civil war in Syria, the fighting in Iraq, for years to come. So this will go on. Having said that, if somebody came along, whether in the 1950s, 1960s, 1970s, 1980s, and asked the question, where are we? Are we better off or worse off in the Cold War? That question would have been unanswerable. Probably even during the Vietnam War, if you had asked that question in 66, 67, 68, it would have been unanswerable. In one case, the Cold War ended with the unanticipated fall of the Soviet Union. In the other, it ended in the invasion and overthrow of the South Vietnamese armed forces. So we have no idea how this is going to come out yet, except that it is going to go on, and that's probably the safest thing to say.
My answer to your question is yes and no. I'll explain. With regards to security against a big one, another 9/11, I think we're better off. I think our intelligence is better. Certainly our major metropolitan police departments know how to protect better, particularly in New York City, Los Angeles Sheriff's Department. So I think another 9/11 is unlikely. However, death by 1,000 cuts is an old Chinese proverb, but also something that bin Laden said numerous times when he was still alive. And we've experienced in the United States homegrown terrorist activity by those that have allegiance or at least believe in an ideology like Al-Qaeda. So I think we're worse off there, and I'm particularly concerned about the foreign fighters that are now fighting in Syria and Iraq, and when they return to their countries, including the United States, we think we have 100 or 150 at least 40 Somalis. We know exactly how many from the Twin Cities and Minneapolis. So I'm particularly concerned about our porous borders. The United States, of course, isn't the only country with porous borders. I'm concerned about European jihadis who come back to Europe that also has porous borders. So for the big one, I think we're better off. I don't think it will happen. But for terrorist events against not just the United States, but the West and other countries, I think we're worse off.
I'm going to say yes. We're much better off. When I say who's the we, we're talking about it. I mean, obviously, if you're in Iraq, Saddam Hussein is looking better today than he has done at any point in recent Iraqi history. But if you're in the United States, 21 people have been killed by jihadi terrorists in the United States since 9/11. And if you said in 2002 that only 21 people will be killed by jihadi terrorists in the United States in the course of the next decade, you would have been laughed off a stage like this. And there's really two big reasons for why Al-Qaeda has had not able to do an attack on the United States. The first areas are defensive measures in the United States are very different than they were on 9/11. Let me just quickly run through them. On 9/11, there were 16 people on the no-fly list. Now there are 40,000, and there's 700,000 in a larger database of people who are suspected with ties to terrorism that would be put into secondary screening if they try to come to the United States. On 9/11, the FBI and the CIA did not talk to each other. I mean, literally, they didn't talk to each other. On 9/11, the FBI wasn't really an intelligence organization in the way that it is today. There are some 2,000 FBI intelligence analysts. On 9/11, there was no TSA, Transportation Safety Administration. No one in their right mind is going to try and put a bomb on an American plane in the United States. Again, if they're not going to succeed. On 9/11, there was no Department of Homeland Security. It's the largest agency in the U.S. In the government other than the Pentagon. On 9/11, there was relatively few joint terrorism task forces. Now there are more than 100 around the United States. And most importantly, on 9/11, there was no understanding, as there has been in this country for a long time, that terrorism is actually a problem. And let me give you three ways that makes, it's a huge force multiplier. If you add it to everything I've just said in terms of defensive capability, think about the passengers who disabled Richard Reed, the so-called shoe bomber, on the flight from Paris to Miami shortly after 9/11. It was the passengers who saw that there was something wrong with this guy and disabled him. Think about the underwear bomber on Flight 253 from Detroit, going over Detroit. It was the passengers who said, hey, this guy, there's smoke pouring out of his crotch. Something is wrong with this picture, and they disabled him. It was the street vendor in Times Square on May 1st, 2010, who said, look, there's a car that is smoking, and this picture doesn't look right. So the United States is now a very hard target. And General Howard referred to the homegrown extremists. We're not going to be able to stop those. So there's always going to be somebody who gets through. And by definition, a lone wolf is not on the radar screen of law enforcement. And we're going to see a Major Nidal Hassan, even though he did come to the attention of the FBI to some degree. We're going to see Sarnia brothers. They're not going to go away. But a lone wolf is not, or even lone wolves who are pairs, there's just a limit to what they can do. It's not 19 people supported by dozens of other people around the world in Afghanistan and Germany and Dubai and other places that did the 9/11 attack. So we are a much harder target. And then add to that our offensive capabilities. General Howard was part of the U.S. Special Operations Forces. Before 9/11, they were never used, which is extraordinary because you think about it, they were founded precisely to go after terrorists. And Joint Special Operations Command, which was founded after the failed Desert One Iran hostage rescue operation, they were a Ferrari in the garage that no one took out of the Ferrari. No one took the Ferrari out of the garage because they were scared of getting a dent in it. And even though, at one point Bill Clinton said, let's get some black ninjas going down into these camps and that will really scare them, the big army never allowed it to happen. Every time Clinton said, let's do something, they would say, well, you need to have more forces. And suddenly it's like the invasion of Normandy. And so it became politically hard to do these kinds of operations. So after 9/11, of course, we've had literally thousands and thousands and thousands of special operations missions, a dozen every night in Afghanistan, 300 a month in Iraq in 2006. And we basically killed these groups. And then add to that the drone program. And under President Bush, there was 4 drone strikes. Every month there was, under President Bush, there was 1 drone strike every 40 days in Pakistan. Under President Obama, it went to 1 every 4 days for the first 2 or 3 years of his presidency. And it just killed them. But who's the best witness for that? Osama bin Laden. He wrote all these memos saying, I'm so concerned, we're going to move, we're going to leave Pakistan. And just one final point on the drones. Under President George W. Bush, there was one drone strike in Yemen. There have been at least 100 under President Obama. So these are, and people sometimes say, well, there's no military solution to this. I actually totally disagree with that. I think there's a military solution that is very, very helpful if you're really looking to impose a great deal of pressure on these organizations. Yes, it's not the only thing, but it is a very big thing. And getting back to the president's speech, we've had 145 drone airstrikes in Iraq. That has put a lot of pressure on ISIS. They're losing ground. They're losing territory. They're past their peak already, in my view.
So picking up on this point, I'm wondering, and I would like to pose this question to the entire panel. So Peter, you argue that we've been successfully in the military realm. Now, oftentimes I think that counterterrorism strategy is kind of reduced to one element, at least in the public debate. But of course, a counterterrorism strategy consists of a variety of elements, right? There's the military realm, there's the intelligence efforts, there's the counter-ideological realm, financial attempts to curtail financing. So Peter, you would argue, I would assume that that the military efforts have been particularly successful. What about the other counterterrorism, the other elements of the counterterrorism strategy? Where have we been more successful? Where have we been less successful?
Let me answer this in the following way. The 9/11 plot, every aspect of that plot couldn't happen today. The training camps in Afghanistan, they don't exist. Yes, there are very small training camps in Pakistan, but they're tiny and people have to move all the time. They're worried about drone strikes. The money transfers that paid for 9/11 that came from Dubai, the US Treasury would be all over that. The conspirators in Germany, who were basically, the command and control for the whole organization, the German intelligence service would be all over that now. The people getting lessons in the United States at flight schools. If somebody said, I'm very interested in landing and taking off in a 747, but nothing else, there would be a lot of attention paid to these people. They wouldn't get in this country into the United States in the first place. They'd be on a no-fly list. Khalid Sheikh Mohammed was the only person on that 16 who was on the no-fly list, but all these people would now be on the no-fly list. So, we have been very successful in each part of these things. But going to this question of counter-ideology, I think that's a waste of time for the following reason. I think that, for the United States, we're not experts on Islam. We can't have a debate about it. All we can say, and this is the one message I think we should always say, is these guys kill civilians, and they particularly kill Muslim civilians. You don't have to be a religious expert to say that. You just keep hammering away at that. And that is the most effective, I think, the only effective message for a Western government to produce.
Thank you. Russ, do you have any?
I agree with Peter, perhaps except for the counter-ideology. I agree that the United States is not the entity that can counter Wahhabist, Salafist ideology. But someone's got to do it.
Yeah.
And until you can have all the military success, you can have the economic success, which is difficult, will be easier against IS. But until you counter the ideology, which is the glue that holds Al-Qaeda franchises, Al-Qaeda wannabes together, we will continue to have this problem.
Yeah.
Brian, do you have any thoughts on which elements, where have we done better, where can we still improve our
when during the NATO summit, Secretary of State, U.S. Secretary of State Kerry, in talking about the efforts that we would take against the Islamic State, said, we realize that not all of you may be as comfortable doing kinetic. And I thought that was one of those striking phrases, doing kinetic, because it implied that that's what we do, and we do it, in fact, we do it fairly well. But it also implies that we tend not to do some of these other things. I certainly would agree with Peter that there are limitations on what the United States can do in terms of this really struggle that is going on within the world of Islam as to its future directions, and our credentials and ability to understand that and mold that are very, very limited. Having said that, I do think that we probably could do more, have not done as much as we should in the area of what might be called political warfare. This is just, there's great resistance to doing this in a democracy. We feel that our cause should be self-evident. These people killed civilians, that should be apparent. Therefore, there is no need to explain. The term propaganda itself has a negative connotation in Western democracies. It somehow is seen as subverting a free press. But nonetheless, I think that there is more that we can do. The good success story, that, by the way, that we did have, and it goes back to the internal, the homegrown terrorists that Peter alluded to earlier. Out of a population of several million Muslim Americans, since 9/11, there have only been approximately 200 homegrown terrorist jihadists that have been charged with material support or attempting to join jihadist fronts or more seriously plotting terrorist attacks in the United States. And that says, despite an intensive online campaign by Al-Qaeda to inspire and instruct homegrown terrorists, they're simply not selling a lot of cars. And that's a positive development. Out of 43 jihadist terrorist plots since 9/11, authorities have uncovered and thwarted 39 of those. And that attests to the effectiveness of very good internal intelligence and the fact that a large percentage of the tips came from the Muslim community itself. So there is an achievement that I think that certainly we can point to. I think there is an area where Europe is having some greater difficulties than we are.
I'd like to go back for a couple of minutes to the point that was raised by Peter before about the military response within the broader counterterrorism strategy. And we certainly, I think the United States has been proven very efficient at killing people, killing terrorists. But isn't there, Peter, and to the other panelists, isn't there perhaps a bit of a dilemma? Because in the short term, these military efforts, they tend to weaken the organizations. But don't we see kind of a boomerang effect in the longer term, in the sense that don't military efforts also, in a way, drive or fuel sympathies towards these organizations? And the reason I'm saying this is that we've, in the most recent operation here in Gaza, Operation Protective Edge, Israeli leaders, in the course of the operation, you could hear the politicians say that, the Gazans, they hate Hamas, they just can't say it. But there have been actually surveys done after Operation Protective Edge that seem to suggest that support for Hamas has actually risen. And so I was wondering if, how do we deal with that? First of all, is there a problem in the military approach?
Yeah, I mean, of course it is. It depends.
How do we deal with
depends. I mean, you have to select your target. So, I mean, the Iraq War, if you were to say the single thing that kept Al-Qaeda alive, and we're still seeing the blowback from that decision today, was the Iraq War. I mean, there would be no Al-Qaeda in Iraq without the Iraq War. Al-Qaeda wasn't in Iraq. So it depends which military decision we're talking about. I think a targeted drone campaign that is very cognizant of what you're suggesting, which is you have to balance, if the cost of a successful drone campaign in Pakistan is that 180 million Pakistanis hate the United States, that's a pretty big cost. So if you look at public opinion polling in Pakistan, support for the United States is now at 9%, so it's close to zero. It's never been high. It was maybe 25% a few years ago. So that's a big cost you have to be aware of. But President Obama, if you look at there's only been 6 drone strikes, I think, this year in Pakistan, maybe 8. And they've been, so there's kind of an understanding that we need to balance these things. So I think if you calibrate it correctly, a drone, you have to take the shots that really count. You can't just use drones as a way of a sort of air force for a counterinsurgency campaign. It needs to be very targeted. It's something that is a very useful tool in your toolkit. And we saw in Somalia with the killing of the head of Shabab. Well, there seems to be no downside for that. There was nobody in Somalia saying, wow, this guy was a great hero and we're angry about it, quite the reverse. So I think it's just a matter of which targets you select and how you go about it and balancing other effects.
I'll just give a personal experience. Right after I started with General Wayne Downing, the Combating Terrorism Center at West Point, we were one of the few focal points then for statistics or policy guidance or policy recommendations, but I could almost tell on a late Thursday afternoon that I would get a call from the J5 in the Pentagon, and they'd want to talk to me about metrics. Well, what are the metrics? And I said, well, and I'm not sure you can use the same metrics you use for conventional warfare. And they said, what do you mean? I said, what metrics are you using? They said, well, you know, we killed 320 this week. I said, well, how many did they recruit? And there was silence. So I agree that the kinetic military is very important. Target selection is very important. I can guarantee that General Petraeus and General McChrystal had a killing machine going in Iraq. I mean, they were very successful. Yet, despite all our successes, we still have a problem. And I'm not sure that we do understand that, you know, exactly still today, what are the metrics for success in a conflict against what we face today? Did I avoid the question enough there?
No, but you actually, you gave me an idea for my next question.
Okay.
But let me first see if Brian...
You know, Americans are pragmatists, and therefore when we make a major investment, we expect to be able to anticipate a return, and so that we can calibrate whether the return has been worth the investment. That doesn't always work in war, but it invariably leads us into metrics. We like counting things. There's kind of a tyranny of metrics, and if the metrics aren't there, we will invent them. Often, the invented metrics measure our own input in terms of the amount of money we're spending on something, the creation of bureaucracies, the creation of new institutions, the number of sorties, the number of this, the number of that. Military machines are good at killing people and destroying things. That's what they do. The challenge is how doing those things translate into permanent progress. During World War II, we could see this on a map. Now we cannot see it, and so, as I say, we invent the metrics. Not bad. I think we are doing better, but again, maybe I carry too much personal baggage on this. I can't remember. I was in Vietnam from '66 through '71. I cannot remember a single briefing in Vietnam, a military briefing, and even subsequent to my being there, up until the time we were taking people off the roof of the embassy in Saigon, that said we were not winning. We were winning right up until the moment we were evacuating the last diplomats from a city that had fallen to our enemies. So I have a great caution about these metrics. Second thing is, yes, we do have military successes, but sometimes they do contribute to problems. I mean, Peter mentioned one, the blowback as a consequence of the invasion of Iraq. The toppling of Gaddafi. I think the planet's better off without him. Who's going to defend him? The unintended consequences was splattering his arsenal across the Sahara and the Sahel as far as the Sinai, and we're still dealing with that. We are now going into Syria and Iraq after the Islamic State. The consequences of that will be that we will scatter thousands of foreign fighters across not only the Middle East and the Arab world, but we'll send them back to Europe where, given some of the disturbing public opinion polls showing support for the Islamic State, they may find fertile ground, and it's not whether they carry out a bombing or a killing at a museum in Belgium, but whether in fact that leads to the kind of unrest on the streets of Europe, particularly given the concurrent rise in extreme right-wing, the kind of violence that we haven't seen on the streets of Europe since the Algerian War in the early 1960s.
I'd like to ask a question. We talked about measuring success in the counterterrorism effort. I'd like to talk for a second about the nature of the enemy, because I think that in some ways, at least to me, it seems that terrorism has evolved in certain respects. Back in the 60s and 70s, we had these organizations like the Red Army Faction or Action Directe, which were small, secretive organizations whose members sometimes seemed to barely be able to fire a weapon. But many of today's terrorist groups, they seem to be, first of all, much, much larger. Many of them, including Hamas, ISIS, or Hezbollah, they're large enough to actually seize and hold territory. My question is, what do these, first of all, are we talking about a broader trend, that these organizations expand into something broader, whether they're militant groups or perhaps insurgencies? And second of all, if that's the case, what do these trends imply for counterterrorism?
You notice we're all three jumping on that one. Look, it is true. In the 1970s, we were chasing small gangs. Terrorism has evolved since then, and it's evolved into something. It is involved. At the same time, we've seen the ideology of jihadism, the ideology that has been created and crafted by Al-Qaeda, that has transcended the organization and spread across Africa, the Middle East, and South Asia, Southeast Asia. At the same time that ideology has spread, over the years, terrorism has evolved from a set of what appeared to be, in retrospect, relatively modest tactics into a mode of conflict that we are going to be combating. And I want to use that verb instead because, look, one of the downsides, there were upsides in terms of mobilization of national will and resources in calling this a war. The downsides were that we would expect, as we do in the West, that war is a finite undertaking with a beginning and an end. So let me get out of that framework and say combating this. We will be combating this ideology. We will be operating in this mode of conflict. We will be combating terrorism, a verb that implies an enduring task for the foreseeable future.
I think it's unfortunate that terrorism isn't an ism like communism, capitalism, socialism, that can be battled with. You can fight it with economic truth, you can fight it by example, you can. Unfortunately, terrorism is, and I think this is, I get a lot of credit for this quote, but I didn't do it first, but terrorism is a tactic. It's been a tactic for centuries, and in my view, will be a tactic in the future. And it's very hard to defeat a tactic, particularly one that's been around for a long time. So when we talk the war against terrorism, I never liked the term. First of all, we weren't fighting a war. When you fight a war, you maximize all the elements of power, not just the military, and you defeat an enemy, which doesn't seem to me like we tried very hard. But you can defeat terrorists, and we have been very successful in doing so. The average life of a terrorist organization is 12 years. Often terrorist organizations barely live for a year. However, Al-Qaeda and those that are focused by an ideology are a much more difficult adversary to address. And again, I say, we can be successful militarily, and we will become more successful militarily, but still, it's the ideology of the present Al-Qaeda, Wahhabis, Salafists, that I think ultimately the ideology will have to be countered if we're going to be successful.
Before I would like to actually also give the audience a chance to ask some questions, but before that I would like to ask one more question, and that's kind of a more forward-looking question. What are the types of threats, of terrorist threats, that you see looming on the horizon? Or in other words, what keeps you up at night, even though I think that General Howard and Jenkins, Mr. Jenkins, with all their fighting experience, probably nothing keeps you up at night, but is there anything, any terrorist threat that you believe is particularly acute?
I think the short answer is no. I don't think there is. I mean, it is easy to say the sky is falling, because when the sky doesn't fall, which it often doesn't, no one says, hey, you said the sky was going to fall, and it didn't. It's harder to say actually things are going sort of okay. I mean, let's say ISIS is a big problem. I don't want to discount that. But let's look at from a Western perspective. It's fascinating to me how little terrorism there is in the West, given particularly in Europe, where 10% of the French population is Muslim, 70% of the French Muslim population is Muslim. So there should be a lot of terrorism in France, but there isn't. I mean, we've had this one Frenchman conduct a terrorist attack on May 24th in Brussels, but that's the first terrorist attack, I think, by a Frenchman, I think since 1995, and the attack on the Paris metro. So we have recognized that this is a problem, and we have pretty good defenses against it, and these groups are a great problem locally where they exist. But as soon as they get territory, they always make the same set of mistakes. They rule like the Taliban. We saw in Mali that they were pushed out by the French. We saw in southern Yemen they were pushed out. Al-Qaeda in Yemen basically lost a lot of its territory. We saw in Shabab has lost much of its territory in Somalia. And the same thing will happen with ISIS, with our help, but also because people don't want to live under ISIS. If they're going along because they have no choice. But if somebody comes in from the outside and liberates them, as will happen over time, I think ISIS will be, 2 or 3 years from now, we'll say they're a problem that's been managed. And going to what both General Howard and Brian Jenkins said, it's a problem almost of language. This is not a war in a conventional sense. We don't have the language to describe it, at least in English, because it's not a law enforcement problem and it's not really a classic military problem. But what we can do is manage it and contain it. And I think generally we have done a pretty good job of managing and containing this. And I think we will do so in Iraq and Syria.
I'll make a prediction, and if I'm incorrect, 20 years from now I'll buy you a steak dinner and a martini. 20 years from now we'll be sitting at this dais, and my guess is we might not be talking about terrorism of the Islam variety. What we'll be talking about with regards to terrorism and those disenfranchised who have a problem, it will be demographic and resource. It'll be population and lack of water. So 20 years from now, invite me back. If I'm incorrect, steak dinner's on me. But if I'm correct, you all are going to be buying me a lot of martinis. Okay.
I agree with Peter that this problem is manageable. At the same time, I think that the kinds of issues we are facing today are going to continue. People say, well, that's a grim view, but I say that because I think we can deal with this in the long run. And the challenge, the concern that keeps me awake is not the typical ones that are invented by armchair terrorists, that terrorists will have this weapon or do this dreadful thing or that dreadful thing. That's not it. It's quite different. Power defined in its crudest sense is simply the capacity to kill, to destroy, to disrupt, to create alarm, to oblige us to devote vast resources to security, is descending into the hands of groups and quasi-states that are not going to behave as states did before, whose grievances, real or imaginary, real whether in terms of resources or in terms of ideology, it's not going to be possible to satisfy. And how we deal with that as democratic societies and remain democratic societies, I think is one of the major challenges that we face. If this continues to go on, and I believe that it will, what we see are measures taken in the name of security, measures taken to preserve the safety of our population, each measure sensible and defensible, but collectively they have a cumulative effect and move us incrementally toward a very different kind of society. And so for me, the question is, can we manage this ongoing threat in a way that truly preserves the kind of society that we want to live in, as opposed to, in the name of security, creating the very kind of society that our terrorist foes would impose upon us.
Thank you very much. I would now like to open the discussion. I have more questions here, but I would don't like to monopolize the discussion, but I'm sure that some of you have perhaps some points. Yes, David Brogue?
I live in southern Texas, and a lot of people I respect report increasingly their certainty that Hezbollah is infiltrating the border to Mexico and building bases on the other side of the border. I'd be curious if you gentlemen find those reports credible or not.
There's no evidence for that.
I disagree. I know some retired Border Patrol agents in southern Arizona. I actually lived in southern Arizona in Cochise County. I've hiked the Huachucas and the Chiricahuas, and as a kid would hike into Mexico, right? Hike back into the United States. There's a rumor, at least going through Douglas, they call it the Yemeni Highway. Now, Peter may be right, there may be no published evidence, but I have been told otherwise, that at least they have found those, they may probably not terrorists, but they're from the Middle East, and they're according to these retired Border Patrol agents, that they are coming up through Cochise County into Arizona and New Mexico.
Let me see if I can bridge the difference between Peter and General Howard on this. Hezbollah, in addition to being a part of government and a militia in Lebanon, is a global criminal enterprise. I mean, they are, because of the business acumen of Lebanese, because of their having been scattered throughout the world, one can look in countries across West Africa, in South America, in Central America, in other parts of the world where they are engaged in an array of criminal enterprises, drug traffic, smuggling, counterfeit, all sorts of things. There is no question that one could look at Mexico and find evidence of Hezbollah-connected criminal activities. One major one internationally is the illegal movement, human trafficking. And if there is money to be made, and there is money to be made, as America's border defenses have increased it becomes increasingly difficult for individuals on their own to run that border. And that has given an opportunity for criminal entrepreneurs to organize this as a highly profitable business. There are a great number of people from the Middle East, from North Africa, who want to come to the United States. So I put together Hezbollah's nose for criminal enterprise, a market demand, and an opportunity on the border, and I can come up with Hezbollah on the border in Mexico. Now, the big question is, and we don't know the answer to this, is that can Hezbollah leadership transform, if it so orders, those criminal networks which it has into an operational terrorist arm? And I don't know the answer to that.
Actually, related to, since David raised the question of cross-border infiltration, because another form of infiltration that Western nations are facing these days is, of course, the threat of foreign fighters. And we're seeing now an unprecedented number of foreign fighters fighting in Syria, arguably more foreign fighters fighting in Syria than in any jihadi theaters combined in the previous decades. And I was wondering if any of you have any thoughts about how Western governments can address the threat of foreign fighters.
I think Western governments are all over this problem. And it's not clear to me that this is the problem that people think it is. There have been 100 Americans who've tried to go to Syria or are actually fighting in Syria, 12 of them with ISIS. Well, we know 2 of them are already dead. By the way, these people who go over are not battlefield geniuses by any stretch of the imagination. And they often get killed in the war because they don't know what they're doing. And sometimes they get killed because they're suicide attackers. And General Howard mentioned the 40 Americans, mostly from Minnesota, who've gone over to Somalia. Well, about a third, more than a third of them got killed in suicide attacks or on the battlefield, or by Shabab itself. A number of them were arrested when they left Somalia, either in Africa or in the West. And about under a third are unaccounted for, but my guess is they're either dead or kind of not. So, you know, if you looked at this from a very, very Machiavellian point of view, the fact that people are going over there and then getting killed is at the end of the world for us. I think the short answer is probably not. And merely because, you know, history doesn't always repeat itself. The reason that we talk about this is because the Afghan war produced this whole generation, including bin Laden. Well, we didn't know it was going to be a problem. Now we know it's going to be a problem. Even the Saudis have made it a criminal offense to go to Syria now. Their clerics have issued fatwas saying that it's against Islam to go. So that even the countries, the Arab countries in the region, are suddenly waking up to this problem. And Turkey is now taking a very, very different attitude to the foreign fighters that have been using Turkey as a transit point. So yes, it's a problem, but it's a problem that is not as existential, I think, as it's being portrayed, generally speaking.
Because we understand the problem of foreign fighters from the Soviet-Afghan war, I think we're much better prepared for the event of a return of foreign fighters in the United States. I am worried about Europe, though, because the numbers, you know, are 3,000, 3,500 with European passports, you know, fungible across borders. So I'm more concerned about what foreign fighters might do in Europe than I am the United States.
I would agree with that. I think U.S. statistics on previous foreign fighters, and as of between 9/11 up to mid-2014, we had a total of 115 people who went abroad or attempted to go abroad to join various jihadist fronts. About a third of them were arrested on the way. A percentage of those who did manage to hook up with groups, as Peter correctly points out, were killed. Another portion of them were arrested abroad. There is a relatively small number. It's actually only about 11 out of that ones we've identified, that are still at large. We don't know if they're dead or alive, but they're unaccounted for. Of those who have returned, there is only a small number of those actually engaged in planning terrorist attacks after they returned. I suspect when they return, we are going to see some of them will come back disillusioned, some of them will come back psychologically damaged, some of them will come back determined to carry on their activities. And we'll expect that in the future.
Can I just add to that, which is all the terrorist attacks since 9/11 in the United States have been conducted by people who had no training overseas. They just got, so.
Sorry.
Yeah.
I think we're getting preempted by...
Sorry, but we have to wind up the panel. Assaf did a great job, as usual. Let's have a hand.